Bonjour, mesdames, messieurs, mes collègues canadiens, africains et tous les autres. Il y a longtemps que je parle en français et alors c'est tout pour moi. Now English. I am delighted to be here to talk with you about Africa's future and the future of U.S.-African trade and investment. The growing economic partnership between Africa and the U.S. is an important one for both sides of the Atlantic. I want to thank Afrique Expansion for the opportunity to be here with you today, and to Madame Gerba and all the leadership of Afrique Expansion, thank you. Before I begin, I should mention that at the U.S. Trade Representative's office, my office focuses on sub-Saharan Africa, the 49 countries now that South Sudan has joined the group. And that's the region that I'll be covering this morning as I speak with you. USTR, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, is within the White House complex, part of that complex, and we are the lead agency on behalf of President Obama in terms of negotiating trade and investment agreements all around the world. So I am focused on the region I think is the most important one at this point. And I have had the privilege of working on African economic and trade issues for many years, giving me a ringside seat as developments have unfolded. Over all the years I have helped manage our trade relationship with Africa, I have never been more impressed with Africa's progress or more positive about its future than right now. Indeed, I agree with President Obama, who during his recent trip to Africa said, quote, "I see Africa as the world's next major economic success story," end quote. The question for us is how to take advantage of Africa's growing opportunities in a way that is mutually beneficial and spurs further sustainable development on the continent. As you know, President Obama visited 3 countries while he was in Africa: Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. And I was delighted that this trip was focused on trade and investment instead of the picture that they always show the Americans of Africa in conflict, babies dying or starving or something, HIV/AIDS pandemic. We fought hard to make sure that President Obama would not be focused on those things while there, but focus on all the positive things that are happening in Africa. And trade and investment was the thing that we knew would help the focus to be positive and the American people to see and to experience as the president was on the continent. In Senegal, the president highlighted Africa's potential for agricultural development, a sector in which there are already many U.S.-African agribusiness partnerships and joint ventures advancing food security. During his visit, which also included stops in South Africa and Tanzania, the president announced 2 major new programs, Trade Africa and Power Africa. Trade Africa aims to increase intra-African trade and expand trade between Africa and the U.S. and other global markets. This program will initially focus on the member states of the East African Community, which is an economic success story offering significant opportunities for U.S. trade and investment. Trade Africa seeks to double intra-regional trade within the EAC and to increase EAC exports to the U.S. by 40%. Also, a new and innovative program, Power Africa, addresses the long-standing severe lack of adequate electricity and power in Africa and aims to work with African governments that want to make reforms in their energy sectors in order to attract private investment and ensure that energy resources are responsibly developed. This program includes a focus on new, creative ways to deliver power through mini-grid and off-grid solutions. In recent years, Africa's growth has been powered by its own dynamic private sector, as well as those of many countries around the world. Increasingly, foreign companies are investing in Africa, opening offices, stores, factories, and other facilities, and generating employment and taxes. African governments, like Africa's partners, understand that sustainable growth in Africa is possible only with an internationally competitive private sector. African governments are doing and must do more to establish business and investment-friendly environments and avoid establishing policies that hinder foreign investment. Let me now turn to what I know is an area of focus for us, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, known as AGOA. AGOA is well known as the centerpiece of U.S. trade engagement with Africa and has received bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress. During the life of this program, now over a decade, U.S. trade with Africa has expanded significantly, increasing from $28.2 billion in 2001, the first full year of AGOA trade, to $72.3 billion in 2012. U.S. exports during this period tripled from $6.9 billion to $22.6 billion, so AGOA has been good for us too. While energy-related petroleum imports from Africa continue to be the largest category, non-oil imports have tripled since AGOA's passage in 2000. Thousands of jobs have been created as trade has diversified into additional areas, including vehicles and parts, apparel, fruits and nuts, beverages, prepared vegetables, cut flowers, footwear, and leather products. And if you ever get the chance to come and visit me at my office in Washington, you'll see I have lots of those products sitting in my office on the table. While AGOA has clearly played an important role in expanding African exports to the U.S. and helping create African jobs, it has also played an important role in providing incentives for African economic reforms, helping to foster an improved business environment. This improved climate is good not only for U.S. businesses, but for African ones as well. However, we all know that AGOA has not been fully utilized. Market access alone is not sufficient. Both Africa and the U.S. need to look at what more can be done. The U.S. recognizes the constraints that many African countries face when trying to take advantage of AGOA and foreign trade in general. Africa still faces many challenges, such as deficits in electric power, inadequate transportation networks, cross-border trade barriers, and continued concerns about the business environment in many countries. However, I must note that some countries are doing exceptionally well. Rwanda, Burundi, and Mauritius, for example, Ghana, and many others are still credited with significant improvements in their business climates. These countries have greatly improved the ease with which investors can do business within their borders. And in fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, 36 of 46 governments, according to the World Bank's annual Doing Business report, have now improved their economy's regulatory environment for the business community. This is a record number of countries improving their business environment since 2005. To help our partners meet the challenges of doing even more and even better, the U.S. has developed a number of trade capacity building programs to help overcome these supply-side constraints and help African governments and African firms take advantage of the market opportunities that AGOA provides. Total U.S. trade capacity building assistance for Africa since 2000 has been $4.5 billion. I would also like to highlight the area of trade facilitation as an important one that is relatively easy to address. Red tape, roadblocks, and duplicative border processes result in inefficiencies and higher costs that impede trade expansion, both within Africa and with its overseas partners. For example, high transportation costs may be hampering trade even more than tariff and non-tariff trade measures. Given the key role that improved trade facilitation can play in boosting Africa's competitiveness and growth, the United States is committed to moving forward in the World Trade Organization trade facilitation negotiations. Africa and the world have changed significantly since AGOA was enacted. More African leaders are committed to trade as a vehicle to economic growth and are taking the sometimes hard political steps needed to improve their country's economic framework. There is also an increasing and welcome focus on regional integration across sub-Saharan Africa. Expanding regional trade is key both to improving Africa's trade competitiveness and its attractiveness to U.S. and other foreign companies many of whom are interested in larger, more integrated markets. In addition, Africa has many new economic partners, including China, Brazil, India, and Turkey. Last year, Malaysia was the largest investor in Africa, not China. Many people don't know that. And these countries are reshaping the trade and investment trends in the region. To be clear, the U.S. welcomes the expanded interests and activities of these countries. They are providing African countries with more investment and new markets for their products, and helping to modernize Africa's infrastructure. Our goal is to be sure that U.S. companies are also able to pursue opportunities on the continent. Why not? The legislative authority for AGOA expires in 2015. As a result, we are now reviewing AGOA in light of the many changes I just discussed that are happening on the continent. In this review of AGOA, we are working with the U.S. Congress and consulting with all the relevant stakeholders to explore what changes can or should be made to AGOA. Ambassador Froman, the U.S. Trade Representative and part of Obama's cabinet, has started the process formally and introduced the idea of that while we were at the AGOA Forum in Ethiopia in August. The Obama administration is committed to a seamless renewal of AGOA, and the review we are undertaking is important given the changes that have occurred in Africa and the global economy since it was originally enacted in 2000. Now that I've talked about AGOA and what the U.S. is doing, I would like to talk about some of the developments in Africa that we simply cannot ignore. In my view, Africa is undergoing a transformation from a continent that was all too frequently viewed in the past as needing aid to a region today where all its partners are focused increasingly on the enormous business opportunities that have developed there. Over the past 10 years and more, Sub-Saharan Africa's transformation has gained momentum. As we know, the economic trends in Sub-Saharan Africa are among the most impressive in the world, and the prospects for further developments are better now than they have been in our lifetimes. Africa's economic growth rate is forecast to be 5% or better this year, with 6 of the 10 world's fastest growing economies being in Africa. The growth is no accident. Leaders around Africa have taken hard political steps to improve governance, deepen democracy, and create better environments for economic development, including promoting the rule of law and transparency. I believe that most African leaders are increasingly focused on making further needed improvements. All in all, the changes across Sub-Saharan Africa have been remarkable. Not only is Africa clearly rising, but its rapidly expanding role in the global trade and commerce is now better understood and acknowledged all around the world. UN agencies, international financial institutions, major global consultancies, and economists virtually all agree that Africa's growth has been remarkable and is almost certain to continue. Most important of all, the private sector in the US, here in Canada, in Europe, and Asia, indeed across the world, are coming to Africa like never before. This expanded private sector interest and activity has become the engine of growth in Africa and will underpin Africa's future development. Although progress has been uneven, with some countries lagging, the trend line across the continent is clear. More growth, more development, more jobs, more trade, and more investment, and you, the African, U.S., foreign, and diaspora private sector, play a critical role. As we all know, Africa has many success stories driven by the private sector. The growth of mobile telephony is one that we cannot ignore. There has also been significant growth in wholesale and retail trade, transportation, telecom, manufacturing, and agriculture in recent years. Growth in all these areas and more is, I believe, set to continue. Another compelling feature in Africa is the rapidly expanding middle class that is more and more prominent. Many international and African businesses see this group as potentially one of the world's most desirable and one of its most underserved markets. Indeed, some 43% of Africans now have enough discretionary income to qualify them as middle-class consumers. Couple this with Africa's youth bulge, and you could be looking at the conditions that will result in even more and more rapid transformation of Africa. As a result of Africa's progress and prospects, investment in Africa has surged, with U.S. investment alone now approaching $40 billion. Indeed, foreign direct investment flows into Africa are now substantially outpacing development assistance or aid. Many people do not know that. This is a remarkable turnaround from just a few years ago and demonstrates the confidence that Africa's transformation is winning in capital centers around the world, especially given the very high, if not the highest, rates of return on investment available anywhere. Another positive sign is that Africa's domestic financial resources are being increasingly mobilized to support development. I believe that the president of Afrique will say much more about this when he speaks a little later. But all of this bodes well for the sustainability of economic development and growth over the long term. In closing, I would like to note that the U.S. has had a long-standing interest in Africa's welfare and a good track record of partnering with its people and governments to promote long-term growth and development. Our policy makes clear that we want to increase our focus on trade and investment by promoting an enabling environment, improving economic governance, promoting regional integration, expanding African capacity to benefit from global markets, and encouraging U.S. companies to trade with and invest in Africa. We now have a Doing Business in Africa campaign that is very active in the U.S. We believe Africa is a region that has not gotten sufficient attention from U.S. business. I would highlight for you that given Africa's amazing transformation and future prospects for growth, the continent offers enormous opportunities for U.S., international, and African companies. There are challenges, yes, but they are being overcome. In this environment, trade and investment remain powerful tools for realizing both Africa's and the United States' economic growth and development priorities. The U.S. remains a committed partner for Africa, and we need to continue working together to find ways to deepen that partnership and increase trade and investment. As I mentioned, the private sector is the key driver of Africa's sustainable growth and development. Given the unparalleled opportunities on the continent, the United States is working through its private sector to alert all of the people to the opportunities that are there. And I would encourage all of you here today to explore what you can do to expand Africa's partnership with North America and indeed with the world at large. Thank you. I'll get close to it, but it's better for you.
So thank you very much, Mrs. Liser. We now have a 10 minutes question period for anyone willing to ask further questions to Mrs. Liser. Nous avons une période de questions de 10 minutes qui est à présent ouverte.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. I have two questions. First question is, you mentioned that you're encouraging U.S. firms to invest and work in Africa. No mention of Canadian firms. Is there any openness on the part of the U.S. government in terms of certain agencies to open up the Brooks Act to allow more Canadian companies to take part in the international tenders, for instance? Well, tenders based on the U.S. procurement system. And my second question is regarding, you mentioned Trade Africa and Power Africa. These seem to be mainly directed towards East Africa, the EAC, as you mentioned. Is there any openness toward moving more towards West Africa, which is essentially, I think a lot of people in this room are involved in? Thank you.
So on the first question, I think that for the most part, we have looked to our Canadian government partners to make sure that the Canadian companies are getting the kind of support that they need in terms of Africa. I believe that we have many of the same goals, and we have agencies that are similar. We have our Overseas Private Investment Corporation You have a comparable agency here in Canada. We have our U.S. Export-Import Bank. You have a comparable agency here as well. So I don't know that there is frankly a focus on U.S. Agencies trying to help Canadian agencies to get into Africa, but we urge all of our developed country trading partners to do what they can to promote business in Africa and to help their respective industries, whether it's Canadian, European, or any of the others, to do business there. Even the Chinese have their Export-Import Bank and funds that are available to Chinese firms to help them be in Africa. On your second question on Trade Africa, actually we're starting with the East African community. That's largely because they have done a lot themselves to combine their economy. I think they're now 130 million people and an $80 billion economy as a whole. And because they have done a lot of work already, we're focused on that. But we're also looking to expand that into other regions. ECOWAS is 14 countries. They have done some work on integrating the 14 countries, but more work needs to be done. We're also working within ECOWAS. We have a trade investment framework agreement with the UMOA countries, the 8 within the 14, and we are working closely with them as well.
A short question for you. I'm a reporter for Commerce Mondial, which is a French version of WorldTrade.com. I would like to ask you, what concrete example can you give us as initiative from the U.S. about restriction to promote better good governance in trade in Africa for business people?
So in terms of what the U.S. is doing, I mean, we work with the Africans on rule of law and good governance issues across a wide range of programs and initiatives we have. What we realize is that it's not just for the sake of trade. Obviously, there are other reasons why we are promoting democracy and good governance there, but also because we know that it does have an impact on the business community. In terms of specific examples, we've gone to a number of countries to talk to them about their some of the non-transparent ways that rules are made with regard to business tenders. We have advocated that as they deal with some of the opportunities to, for example, build roads or invest in the ports, sometimes the transparency is lacking, and we have any number of cases where we have done that. One of the ways that we've been able to get at that is through our Millennium Challenge compacts, where, for example, Benin was focused on developing the Port of Cotonou, and in that process, it was very important for them as money was poured in from the NCC compact to revamping the port. It wasn't just the physical infrastructure, it was also the way that the port was being operated. And now that that compact has been completed, I don't have the figures in front of me, but the efficiency in terms of the working of the Port of Cotonou has been rapidly increased. So I could give you lots of examples, but you asked for a few, that would certainly be one of them.
Il y a eu beaucoup de critiques après la dernière visite du président Obama en Afrique. Autant au cours de sa première visite, on avait dit des choses très positives. Il avait choisi le Ghana comme un modèle de démocratie en Afrique. Autant on a constaté que lors de son deuxième voyage, il semblait avoir d'autres considérations. Les gens ne comprenaient pas, par exemple, qu'il soit allé en Tanzanie, qui n'est pas nécessairement un modèle de démocratie. Alors, les gens se demandent aujourd'hui comment est-ce que les États-Unis vont faire pour concilier à la fois la promotion des droits de l'homme en Afrique et les affaires. Est-ce que les Américains ne vont pas finalement ressembler de plus en plus aux Chinois qui préfèrent fermer les yeux sur ce qui se passe côté droits de l'homme et s'occuper des affaires. Et comment est-ce que les Américains vont faire pour être différents de la Chine aujourd'hui?
Well, I can assure you we are very different than the Chinese, and are viewed very differently than the Chinese in Africa. I think that, as I've traveled around the continent, and I had the privilege of being in Tanzania with the president as he met with both U.S. and African CEOs there. And to be frank, there was a discussion of the opportunities that are on the continent. Well, these CEOs were from a wide range of companies from around the continent, both U.S. and African. But they also talked about the challenges. And President Obama was, he asked a lot of questions. And in fact, when he talked about the leaders meeting, that he hopes to have the first ever leaders meeting that he will sponsor in 2014, he said that he would like to have a part of that meeting be the business community in both Africa and the U.S. Talking to the leaders about the issues that they face there. On things like human rights, I don't think there's any question of the role that the United States has played on human rights and promoting human rights, good governance, immigration, conflict resolution. We have a long history of doing that. We continue to support a number of efforts with our international partners, the UN and others, to address human rights concerns. I can tell you, for example, that even in the annual review of Go eligibility, we have had countries over the years where, because of the lack of rule of law, because of things that were happening on human rights and other conflicts, they were made ineligible for AGOA. And one of the things that is very, I think, one of the success stories is Cote d'Ivoire, which unfortunately we had to make ineligible for AGOA for a few years. But when things went back to normal and a number of the peace issues had been addressed, when rule of law had been reestablished, we immediately went back to the table and made a recommendation to the president to make Cote d'Ivoire eligible again for AGOA. And we will do the same for other countries that have lost their AGOA benefits. We will do the same again. But that's part of the way that we think, supporting rule of law, good governance in these countries. And if withholding trade benefits will help them to do that and focus on what they need to do, then fine. In some cases it does, in some cases it doesn't. Madagascar, I can just use that as an example. They've now been ineligible for AGOA for 4 years. Every year they tell us they're going to hold elections. Every year they told us since then they will hold elections. There was a coup, as you know, and every year goes by and the elections don't happen. So we're waiting and we're working with them, helping them to get back to the table, all the factions get back to the table and do what they need to do for the Malagasy people. I mean, I've been to Madagascar. I visited those factories where there were thousands of women who were working in those factories. Now those factories have closed down. And, it hurts my heart that has happened. But the bottom line is that those people who took over that government and who caused chaos in that country, they need to be held accountable for that. And they need to get back to the table, they need to hold elections there, and they need to get those factories reopened.
Bonjour, je me présente. C'est l'établissement lycéen Import-Export au Mali. Je parle au nom de certains de mes collègues qui sont là. Donc, vous avez dit que vous avez investi des milliards au Mali pour le développement et pour le secteur privé. Nous constatons qu'au Mali, on n'a pas vu de l'argent en provenance des États-Unis pour les opérateurs économiques. Le pays qui nous aide chaque année, c'est bien le Japon pour la France, pour le secteur économique. Et on vous demande si dorénavant vous devez investir de l'argent, des milliards, pour le secteur privé au Mali, passez par un secteur qui est bien connu, le champ de commerce du Mali. y a un rapport direct avec les commerçants. Mais si cet argent est donné au gouvernement, on ne sait pas là où les sommes colossales sont parties. Nous, en tant qu'opérateurs économiques, on n'a pas vu ces traces. C'est notre...
Thank you. So let me just make sure that I wasn't misunderstood. When I said there were billions that had been invested in Africa in trade capacity building assistance, I wasn't speaking just of Mali as a total. But in the case of Mali, Mali is actually one of about 14 sub-Saharan African countries that had a Millennium Challenge Compact account. I don't have with me here the figures, but before I leave, I will give you what has been invested in Mali. And I can tell you, I recall that for Mali, the sectors that were focused on, there were some farm-to-market roads that were built. There was a particular region of Mali where they wanted to focus on rice and the development of rice as a product both for regional export as well as for international export. And part of the reason they gave us was that they didn't want to continue to be so dependent on cotton. And most of Mali, as you well know, most of Mali's foreign exchange and its exports are related to its cotton sector. So when they had the opportunity to use however much money it was hundreds of millions, I'm sure, for Mali, they then decided that they were going to move to a different area of the country. They were going to, I think it was the north, they were going to develop the rice sector and farm-to-market roads from that sector. Perhaps you didn't see any of the benefits of it because you're not in that region or weren't involved in that sector. On the point of whether the U.S. government would, as a part of its trade capacity building programs, give support directly to businesses as opposed to governments. I think as a government, we have a responsibility to work with the other governments and hopefully to establish partnerships with them where the business community does in fact benefit. And we think that we're doing that right now. I know that, for example, through our regional trade hubs, there's one in Senegal and Ghana for West Africa, one in Gaborone, Botswana for the Southern African countries, and one in Nairobi, Kenya for the East African countries. We are directly working with the businesses to help them to come to U.S. trade shows. We're helping them to improve their packaging, improve productivity in their products. Sometimes we go to the factories. I personally have visited many factories in Africa to try to see what can they do to increase the level of products that they're producing, the competitiveness of those products, and then be able to sell them in the United States market. So I know that we are working with African businesses closely. Whether we give them direct access to funding, that may be a different issue, but we're helping them, as I said, come to trade shows, setting up the signage for them, all of that we're doing. So what I would do is encourage you to find out more in Mali about how your business community can get access to some of those same services. I would direct you to the West African Trade Hub to do that.